Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Spartan Theology. Today I have a pretty interesting and especially timely interview. We're going to be talking about a very Christmas-related topic. I got Dr. Jonathan Rowlands on. I'll let him introduce himself here in a second, but just to kind of introduce the topic, he wrote a paper about the whole idea about Jesus being born in Bethlehem and some of the claims surrounding that. And well, like I said, we'll get into the topic, but first I just want to let him introduce himself for everybody out there who doesn't know who he is. And if you could just tell people kind of what you do, what got, not too much. I mean, just can kind of be short or long, whatever you want to do. But yeah, just kind of who you are, what you do, and why you're interested in this topic a little bit. I think that's good for people. Mm-hmm.
And then moved back to Nottingham in 2015 to do my PhD, which I finished earlier this year, thankfully. So the topic we're looking at today, Bethlehem, this originally started as an undergrad. I was at Nottingham. I was doing a module called The Life and Teaching of Jesus, essentially all about the historical Jesus, with a professor called Rowlands, who is now at a seminary in Germany, who was my PhD supervisor. And I essentially, for that module, I wrote an essay on this topic, and then kind of had it in the back burner of my head for a few years after that. I thought about doing my PhD on it, decided not to, but I'm now kind of revisiting the idea of Jesus' birthplace and questions about messianic expectations regarding the birthplace of the Messiah in this period for my next project. So yeah, that's me.
Cool. Yeah, have you been in? I guess what I would like to ask these people, because I'm interested too. What kind of got you into biblical studies? I guess we can kind of talk about that just a little bit. Have you always thought of yourself as someone who would work in academia, or did you kind of? I don't know. I think some people have different paths to get there or whatever. But have you? Yeah, I'm kind of curious what got you interested, because it's definitely a pretty niche market or whatever. There's not a lot of people who see themselves as a kid I'm going to be a biblical scholar. So
yeah, and there's definitely not loads of jobs at the minute either. I'm sure if you ask anyone at my stage of their career, they'll attest to that. The short answer is I got into academia because I wanted to be a lawyer. So I was kind of choosing my A-level topics. So for people who are watching this in the States, who may not know, A-levels are the last 2 years of school in the UK. It's what you do just before you go to university. So because I'd grown up going to Catholic schools and going to a Catholic church, I was familiar with the Bible stories. So was struggling to pick my last A-level subject, decided to do RS because I thought it'd be easy, honestly. And because it was an essay-based subject, and that would be good for getting into university to do law. Very quickly realised I in no way wanted to be a lawyer. So, and at the same time realised that actually, as part of my A-level studies, we were doing John's Gospel, and I found that I was really enjoying that. Was enjoying starting to grapple with some of the more kind of historical, critical questions that we ask in New Testament and biblical studies. And so I decided to go do that instead. Loved my time as an undergrad at the University of Nottingham, so decided to do a master's. Loved that, so decided to do a PhD. Loved that, so decided to get a job, and thankfully managed to get one I'm loving at the minute. So yeah, it all started out with that one A-level choice, weirdly enough. Here I am, quite a few years later, still going.
No, that's really cool. So we'll kind of get into the topic of the actual, just the paper here, and I'm trying to think the best way to go about actually bringing it up. So I think the paper is about, is the idea that Jesus was born in Bethlehem kind of made up by the authors after the fact just to solidify his claims, or is this something that was preserved or not, like an actual event. So if you could kind of lay out, like, what's the consensus in scholarship right now on this? Because I know, like, a lot of, just everyday church people are going to think, oh, of course, it's like, it's written right there in Luke. It's pretty clear that he was born in Bethlehem. So, yeah. So what's like the consensus in scholarship? What do most biblical scholars think about this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say by far and away the vast majority of biblical scholars and historical Jesus researchers who look at the issue of where Jesus was born lives of Jesus start emerging, and we start getting what starts to resemble modern historical critical scholarship on Jesus. Even at the early stages, there's fairly strong consensus that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem. The reason for that, like you've alluded to already, is the fact that in Matthew's Gospel, at the very least, Jesus' birth in Bethlehem is presented as a fulfillment of prophecy. So Matthew quotes Micah 5:2, which is Micah 5:1 in the Hebrew, so people might know it as different verses. And there Micah says, you have this prophecy in Micah, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, which essentially is just Bethlehem. One of the little ones of the clans of Judah, from you will come forth a ruler to rule over Israel. And Matthew presents this verse in Micah as being fulfilled in Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. So Jesus is the ruler to emerge from Bethlehem Ephrathah. And so when you start to get historical critical scholarship on the issue of Jesus' birthplace, the consensus very quickly becomes, well, because it's presented as a fulfillment of prophecy, it can't have actually happened. Instead, what's happened is they have moved Jesus' birthplace to Bethlehem in order to make him fulfill this prophecy, to strengthen the claim that he is the Messiah. And there are other issues as well. I mean, one of the things that the scholars highlight very early on is the fact that Matthew and Luke seem to contradict each other when it comes to the birth narratives. So we only have the two birth narratives in the whole of the New Testament. It's only Matthew and it's only Luke who tell us where Jesus was born. Nobody else seems to be really interested in that, and we'll talk about that again later, I'm sure. But the way Matthew and Luke present what happens, they both seem to contradict each other a little bit. Luke has some information that doesn't seem to hold up to historical scrutiny regarding the census. There is a very long debate going on in scholarship as to whether this census under Augustus actually happened. And so for these reasons, scholars have generally assumed that Jesus wasn't actually born in Bethlehem. When it comes to the prophecy, the specific Micah prophecy, generally what happens is scholars fall into one of two camps. So either you'll get statements like it would be fitting, or it would be appropriate, or it would be kind of neat for the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem. And therefore, Matthew and Luke move the birthplace to Bethlehem to strengthen the claim. And then you get some other scholars who go even further and say that the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem. According to common messianic expectations of their day, the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Everyone knew this, everyone expected this. And therefore, if Jesus is to be proclaimed to be the Messiah, he has to be born there. But either way, the same argument is underlying, that there was this common expectation that there was a Messiah coming who would be born in Bethlehem. And therefore, Matthew and Luke feel theologically and I guess kind of evangelistically obligated to move the birthplace to Bethlehem. Fine, don't worry. It's fine, don't worry. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Sure. It's fine, don't worry. Yeah, yeah. Sure. It's fine, don't worry. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of the main I guess like one point I would really want to like push in this paper is that this underlying assumption that connects all of these different arguments about Jesus' birthplace. So this underlying assumption that there was some kind of expectation that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Actually, when we look at the sources that we have prior to Matthew and Luke, um, and it might be worth us talking a little bit about the relationship between Matthew and Luke at some point later on if we get there as well. Well, no, I'm happy to talk about that later when we get to the Gospels. But yeah, so I think the main point I'd want to make is that this common expectation, or this allegedly common expectation that people expected the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem. Actually, when we look at the sources, there's very little evidence for this. So it's often taken for granted, and it's often just presented as well. Matthew quotes Micah, therefore this is evidence that Micah was a messianic prophecy, or Micah was interpreted as a messianic prophecy, suggesting that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. But actually, Micah 5:2 or 5:1, however we want to divide the verses up there, Micah 5 is originally not a messianic prophecy. There are, I mean, I don't think this is too controversial to say, but it might be. I don't think there are any messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, insofar as they were written and understood in their original context. So there are passages that quite clearly are later interpreted in messianic terms. So in Isaiah, where you get the passage of the suffering servant, in Daniel, where you get the phrase the Son of Man, all of these things are, of course, interpreted by the early Christians, the early Jesus movement, as in messianic terms. But in their original context, I think the word Mashiach, so the Hebrew word Mashiach, which we get the English Messiah from, I think that appears 35 times in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and not once is it referring to a future figure who will come and redeem Israel or bring Israel out of exile, or anything that might be construed as a Messiah, anything like that. So all of these passages, including Micah 5, which are later interpreted as being messianic, as later interpreted as referring to the coming Messiah, in their original context, they're not doing that. They're doing something different. And Micah 5:2 is referring to a leader. It's referring to a ruler. So it's a political thing. It's referring to a monarch. It's not referring to any Messiah in that context. And it's not interpreted in messianic terms, as far as I can tell, having looked at everything I can get my hands on, which isn't to say that that's everything that exists. But as far as I can tell, Micah 5:2 is only ever interpreted in messianic terms for the first time in Matthew's Gospel. This is the first instance of someone connecting Micah 5:2 to a figure who is claimed to be the Messiah. Similarly, other messianic figures in the similar period, other than Jesus, none of them are claimed to be the Messiah because of their birthplace. So no messianic figures in this period are said to have been born in Bethlehem. So it's quite clearly possible for someone to be called the Messiah without having been born in Bethlehem. That seems to be very easy to do. And actually, if we think about it, Mark and John and the rest of the New Testament writers are all fairly happy to do that as well. So the main argument I want to present in this paper is that actually this underlying assumption that there's a common expectation Jesus will be born in Bethlehem isn't necessarily borne out by the sources. And we can talk about the implications of that this might have if it's true for Matthew and Luke in a little bit maybe. But yeah, that's the kind of the main argument I'm making.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you say that like the first place we see Micah 5:2 used as prophecy is in Matthew. Is that like a claim that people might argue with, or that just, I don't know, because like I said, that's so, like you point out in the beginning, that's so almost like obvious that in academia that like, okay, the Micah 5:2 was seen as a prophecy and like had to be fulfilled by Jesus to be the Messiah. So like, but if the case is that it was really never interpreted as prophecy until Matthew, like that seems to be very strong evidence. That's what, like, as I was reading the paper, I'm like, okay, yes, it's really, really big. So do you think people just kind of take it for granted that like it was seen as prophecy, or is there something that they're looking at? I don't know, kind of where are they getting that idea from that kind of goes against what you're saying here a little bit, or I'm just, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does come from Matthew. To be honest, I think that's where this argument is being taken from. So the idea that Matthew presents Micah 5:2 as a messianic prophecy, therefore it was commonly expected that there was this messianic expectation. I think it's also really interesting that Luke doesn't quote Micah 5. Luke just presents Jesus as having been born in Bethlehem, but doesn't say that it's a fulfillment of Micah 5, at least not explicitly. I mean, presumably it's going on in the background, and I mean, people would disagree with me on this, but I think Luke is copying from Matthew. I think Matthew was written first, not first as in before Mark, but first of the two of them.
So you don't
and then
hold
Luke
to
is
Q source or whatever.
No, I'm a Q denier.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm like pretty good friends with John Depew and his wife Laura Robinson, who she worked a lot with Mark Goodacre and stuff, and they're definitely against the whole Q idea too. So I don't really have like a strong stance, but I'm kind of familiar with people starting to reject that idea more and more. It seems like.
Yeah, I think especially in a UK context.
Okay.
I think, and I could be wrong about this because this is my impression from a conference I was at a few years ago, but I think if you go to German universities or you chat with German scholars and you say that you don't believe in Q, they would still kind of laugh you out of the room. But certainly in the UK, there's a growing pool of scholars who think that Q didn't exist, and actually think that maybe Luke copied from Matthew and Mark, and that makes the most sense of the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay.
So yeah. So thanks. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that Matthew is the only writer that I can find until the Targum of Jonathan, which is mentioned in the paper, which is a later Jewish text, so at least into the 2nd century. There are lots of issues about how we date that text, which we won't get into unless you're desperate to. But I don't think that would be very interesting. So until the 2nd century, Matthew is, as far as I can see, the only writer, the only Jewish or Jewish Christian writer who connects Micah 5:2 with any sort of messianic expectation explicitly. Luke obviously does implicitly. There are some who would also suggest that John in John 7 would also implicitly evidence this kind of connection between Micah and Bethlehem. Again, we can talk about that in a little bit. But Matthew's the only one. And even there in Matthew, I think it's really telling that Matthew actually misquotes the Micah prophecy. So the Micah prophecy originally says, Bethlehem, one of the little clans of Judah. Whereas in Matthew's gospel, he changes it. So it's by no means least of the clans of Judah. Which suggests that Matthew actually feels as though he has to make Bethlehem more important than it is even in the original prophecy, in order for the prophecy to be convincing. And even then, Micah 5:2 isn't the only prophecy there. It's a compound citation with a text from 2 Samuel 5, I think, off the top of my head. But I have my notes there. So even there, Matthew's not only quoting Micah, he's smashing two things together, and he's making the Micah prophecy even more convincing than it would have been in its original context. Which I just think, if there was this common messianic expectation based around Micah 5:2, you just wouldn't need to do. If everyone expected that Micah, based on Micah 5:2, that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, why do you need to then dig up Bethlehem? This only makes sense if Matthew is the first person who's making this connection. And I think that's borne out by the fact that no other text connect Bethlehem with the Messiah. No other messianic claimants in between the Micah text and Matthew are said to be given a Bethlehem birth, said to be born in Bethlehem, said to come from Bethlehem. David's own children aren't born in Bethlehem. So clearly it's possible to be of Davidic lineage and not be born in Bethlehem. So there's all this evidence for me which seems to suggest that Matthew is the first person who is making this connection. One of the difficulties with it is that what we're really talking about is an absence of evidence, which isn't the same as evidence of absence.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to talk about texts that don't exist.
Yeah. And you definitely point that out in the paper, that just because they don't talk about it doesn't necessarily make it true, but it's something to think about. And like we kind of talked about before we started to, we only have what we have to work with, so we have to kind of just, does this fit with does the evidence that we do have fit with what people are saying? And you're kind of saying, well, not necessarily, and I think it makes a lot of sense for sure. If it was so obvious that he had to come from Bethlehem, that they were willing to essentially make up a story about this whole thing about why he was born in Bethlehem, then it seems like you're right. The whole misquoting of the thing seems very weird to kind of play it up even more. It seemed like everybody knows he had to be born in Bethlehem, and look, he was. It would seem like it would be something more along those lines, as opposed to, let me pull out this obscure line from the Hebrew Bible that's not even a prophecy and connect it to something that didn't have, it just seems odd. You're right. And it seems to make a lot more sense that okay, he was born in Bethlehem. That seems somewhat odd, seeing how everyone knew him as Jesus of Nazareth, or something along those lines, and like Matthew just like makes this connection as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just the fact that there are other figures in I guess kind of the 1 to 200 years either side of the BC to CE change, who are claimed to be the Messiah, or there's discussion about whether or not they might be the Messiah, and none of them are said to be born in Bethlehem. It's clearly very possible to be a wannabe Messiah without having been born in Bethlehem. So Simon Bar Kokhba, who led the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s CE, obviously not born in Bethlehem, but is by some people called the Messiah. So it's very obviously possible. Herod, there's some discussion about whether Herod might be a messianic figure, obviously not born in Bethlehem. There are all kinds of figures and messianic claimants who are not born in Bethlehem. So at the very least, the idea that Jesus would have had to have been given a Bethlehem birth to be given a credible messianic claim doesn't seem to hold up to the surrounding context and to the text we have from the same period. I mean, related to this as well, what we're talking about at the minute is conceptions of a Davidic Messiah, so a Messiah who is descended from David. But that's not the only type of Messiah we have in this period. When we have, if we read the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are whole hosts of different messiahs, not all of them descended from David. You get texts with two different messiahs emerging at the same time. You get texts where it's very clear that we don't know where the Messiah comes from. And again, this is evidenced in John 7. We have this claim that the crowds say to Jesus' disciples, "We know where this man is from, and when the Messiah comes, nobody will know where he's from." So if you wanted to create a fake background for Jesus, say that he was the Messiah, if anything, it's easier to just make his birthplace more obscure, not less obscure. That would be one
not
possibility.
Included at all. Yeah, like we don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Like there are much easier ways of adding messianic legitimacy to the life and teaching of Jesus, other than giving him a Bethlehem birth. That's just kind of one option amongst many. I mean, when we get to a guy called Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, he has this dialogue with Trypho is one of the texts, and it's a really interesting text because it's only one half of a conversation, which means it's slightly difficult to read, but essentially it's a dialogue between a Jew and a Christian about whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. And so through this one-sided conversation, because we don't have Trypho's response, we only have Justin Martyr's responses to Trypho's response, we can kind of start to paint a picture of how these messianic claims were constructed, what would have been convincing, what wouldn't have been convincing. And Trypho, this 2nd century Jew, says that even the Messiah doesn't know that he's the Messiah until Elijah comes back. So the Messiah could just be kind of walking around like some kind of divine sleeper agent almost, not knowing that he's the Messiah, not knowing that he will have this role to fulfill. And when Elijah comes, he will then reveal who the Messiah is. So there are all these different options. It's Second Temple Judaism is anything but monolithic. There are a whole host of views. There are a whole host of different schools of thought. And so the idea that Jesus would have to have his birthplace placed in Bethlehem in order to be claimed to be the Messiah is simply not true, essentially. I mean, I think it's another thing to say that maybe it would strengthen the claim, but at the very least, I think it's fairly safe to say that Jesus doesn't have to be born in Bethlehem in order to be claimed to be the Messiah, if for no other reason than the rest of the New Testament doesn't make that claim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a few places we could kind of go from here. Because we don't see it anywhere in Paul at all.
Yeah.
And you would think if he was trying to make a claim somewhere, I mean, you don't see it even in, like, as I'm thinking through now, you're talking about like the rest of the New Testament. You don't really see it throughout like Acts or whatever, do you? And like any of the like sermons or whatever that they give. I don't, as off the top of my head, I could be wrong, but I don't feel like they necessarily like, as they're kind of like with Stephen's sermon or whatever, he doesn't mention that and times like that. Yeah, so it's just not something like you see. So when people make this claim that like he had to be born in Bethlehem, it just doesn't seem to make sense with what we have. Like if, and then as you were kind of talking too, I was thinking like, just to be from David, like throughout the Old Testament, we don't see like the place, the birthplace necessarily, like just because you're like from Abraham, you're not born in this certain place, or like descendants of Isaac are not necessarily born in this specific town or anything like that. Like the judges don't necessarily all rise up from like a specific town or anything like that. It more has to do with like you said, their bloodline or whatever. It really doesn't have to do with where they were born. So it seems weird for the New Testament to just start pulling out these claims out of nowhere, just like when they don't really like. I mean, I could see if we had evidence like for the idea that Jesus was descended from David like by blood, then yes, then we could say like that's obviously something that he needs to have to be a Davidic Messiah. But then you even said you're right, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff, we see all these different people that don't even necessarily descended from David. Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I think the Dead Sea Scrolls, you touched on that a good bit in the paper too, and you kind of talk about that, how we really just don't see, they don't, I think you said really we don't see anything about Bethlehem being a expected place of birth from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's probably where we get like some of the most information about what was expected from a Messiah.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, one kind of caveat to that is that fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls are obviously like still being published even now. So I mean, something could. I mean, I imagine people are on their holidays now, but I mean, you know, someone could publish a fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls on Monday, and it's, you know, it's got the Messiah must be born in Bethlehem, and then the whole thing's scuppered. But I mean, as far as we know, there's nothing in the Dead Sea Scroll fragments about a Messiah coming from Bethlehem. There's stuff about a Davidic Messiah, so a Messiah that's descended from David. But I mean, lineage and birthplaces work exactly the same back then as they do now, in that to be descended from someone, you don't have to be born in the same place as them. I mean, that's not changed. That's very much still the case, and is evidenced by the fact that none of David's children are born in Bethlehem. None of David's children are born in the place that David was born in. And presumably, if one of David's children wanted to be claimed to be the Messiah, then I mean, they would have a good a case as any in terms of ancestry, but obviously wouldn't have been born in Bethlehem. It's not a problem. So yeah, and the other important text to note whenever we talk about kind of messianic thought in this period is the Psalms of Solomon. Again, issues about dating that text, but I think probably after or a similar time to the Gospels. But and again, I mean, it talks about a Davidic Messiah, but there's no reference to Bethlehem. It's just never, the connection's never made, and the connection to Micah 5:2 isn't made anyway. On top of the connection to Bethlehem specifically. So yeah, like there just doesn't seem to be any evidence that there was any kind of expectation that someone would be born in Bethlehem. Certainly, there was lots of expectation that there would be a Davidic Messiah, but that is not the same as a Bethlehem-born Messiah.
Yeah, for sure, and that's really interesting. Like it really is. Like most, like you said, it's almost taken for granted that it was made up. And when you really, like you did here, dive into the evidence, we're just not seeing why that would be the case or where the motivation to make this up is coming from. And that's super interesting. And I know I think we might have kind of brushed over it a little bit too, is this whole idea of in the Gospels, especially in Luke, with like the census, that people, that's like a big thing that I've been hearing a lot, how people don't necessarily even think the census took place, or how like the timelines aren't really lining up and it kind of seems like this whole Bethlehem thing was kind of that's from what one of my buddies who's an atheist and studies a lot of, is really into like this stuff, kind of the way he put it, and I'm no expert, so I was just kind of listening to what he was saying, and he just kind of said that like it's clear that like the census, the timeline doesn't line up. Like I forget exactly how I said it, but there's like a 10-year gap within like 2 verses or whatever, the way he was kind of explaining it to me, and it just seems clear that like this was inserted, and it just doesn't line up. But I think, like I said, I think we kind of touch on that a little bit? I think we like talked about it here or there, but kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I mean, one thing to say is that so all these claims about Bethlehem are made in isolation for the rest of the birth narratives, because the birth narratives are historically problematic, to put it nicely. And one of the issues, like you say, is this issue of the census. The census that's apparently decreed by Augustus, that everyone should go back to the town they were born in, to be accounted for. And there are a few issues with this, not least because that's not how censuses work, either now or back in the Roman period. You don't, like, if there was a census today, I wouldn't have to go back to Liverpool. I could stay here in Nottingham. That's, it would be the case then. There's no evidence that you would have to travel back to your hometown to be counted in a census. The other problem with it is that Jesus is said to be born under Herod the Great, who died around 4 or 3 BC. We don't have any evidence of any census of any kind happening until about 6 CE. So that's probably where your friend has got this.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So just logically, it can't have happened when Herod was in charge and when Augustus decreed a census, because the only census that we know of happened in 6 CE, and Herod died in 4 or 3 BC. So that's quite a big problem historically, and unfortunately, it's not one that I have an easy answer to. I think that is a problem, and I think that's a problem that Christians need to take seriously. I don't think it's I don't think it's like, oh well, therefore Christianity is untrue or anything ridiculous like that. But I mean, I think if we're going to be intellectually honest, I think we need to say, like that seems very, very difficult. Also, there seems to be some contradictions between Matthew's account and Luke's account. Matthew has them in Bethlehem and then fleeing Bethlehem to go to Nazareth, and then Jesus is brought up in Nazareth. Luke has them in Nazareth and then going to Bethlehem for the census and then coming back to Nazareth. So there seems to be some contradiction in those accounts as well. So that's why, for the most part, the birth narratives are considered very historically dodgy, to put it mildly, by a lot of historians. But I think the issue of Bethlehem, I think it's significant that that's the one point they agree on. So I don't know, and this is just complete speculation at this point, but I imagine that they both have this tradition that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and they're kind of they're building a framework around that, essentially.
Yeah. If I could so that makes a lot of sense. So like basically what you're saying is like we need to take every like detail kind of separately and see what's going on here. Like, and when we look at Bethlehem specifically, we don't see any you're kind of concluding that like maybe there's all these other issues are there for sure, but to say that they're there just to like add to the and the Bethlehem thing is just as problematic, and like they're all combined or whatever, you're saying nah, maybe not necessarily. Let's look at this Bethlehem claim. It seems odd that they line up here, and that like there's really no reason to see. I kind of see what you're getting at for sure. It's like I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think I understand.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, like, really simply, like, if two things contradict each other, if two stories contradict each other, it doesn't then logically follow that every detail of both stories is untrue.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that one story is completely true, one is completely false. It could be that shared bits of both are true and the differences are false. It could be, I mean, there could be all sorts of things. It's just because there are these, and there are quite serious contradictions. Just because there are these contradictions, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it means at the very least we need to look into it in a bit more detail, like you say.
Yeah, for sure. That's super interesting, and that's like what I'm kind of trying. That's like a big part. Like that right there is really awesome. That like what I'm trying to do with my channel is like expose people to these ideas. You can't just put your head in the sand and say, "Oh, there's no contradictions at all. It's fine." Just like, and then do all this like mental gymnastics essentially to like make them work when there are serious issues that we need to look into and try and do the research and figure out. But like I say, you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And your research on this specific topic of Bethlehem has found some pretty interesting things that could lead us to maybe this is like part of the thread that is actually true that's being preserved through these things. And maybe the whole like the timeline is messed up a little bit here or there, but like this Bethlehem claim specifically has a lot of merit.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know exactly what we want to go to next. If you have another.
Well, I think one of the things that, so we've talked a lot about Matthew and Luke. One of the things that's worth touching on briefly is John 7, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Because there's a lot of debate about John 7. Let me just find my notes on John 7. So other than Matthew's birth narrative and Luke's birth narrative, the other place in the New Testament where it's occasionally argued that there is some evidence for this expectation that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem is John 7:41 to 42. And there you get, so this is when Jesus is in Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles, and the crowd are asking Jesus' disciples questions about who Jesus is. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. So some of the crowds say to the disciples, "We know where this guy's from, but when the Messiah comes, we won't know where he's from. So he can't be the Messiah because we know where he's from." Some other people, some other members of the crowd say, "Well, the Messiah is from Bethlehem, but we know that this guy is from Nazareth. So he can't be the Messiah because he's from Nazareth, not Bethlehem." The reason why I think this doesn't hurt the case is that there is a long tradition of scholarship on John's Gospel that interprets bits of the Gospel ironically. So opponents of Jesus, and it is largely opponents of Jesus, say things that ironically witness to the truth, and they ironically give the reader an insight into the truth which they themselves aren't aware of. So one example of this is in John 3, where you get Jesus talking to Nicodemus, who's this Jewish leader, and Jesus says to Nicodemus, you need to be born again, and Nicodemus says, how am I to get back into my mother's womb, basically. And it's this whole like ironic thing going on of actually Nicodemus is witnessing to the truth, but he doesn't realize that he is. And there's quite a big split in scholarship as to whether John 7 41 to 42 should be interpreted ironically or not. So is it just should we just take this passage at face value, that is John saying that Jesus is from Nazareth, but it doesn't matter? So is John saying just at face value, yes, the Messiah was probably expected to be born in Bethlehem, but it doesn't matter that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem? or should we interpret this ironically so that the crowds think that Jesus is from Nazareth, but actually he's from Bethlehem?
Yeah,
And this,
as you're bringing that up,
sorry, go on.
yeah, no, just something that popped in my head, and I think could kind of relate this to people too. Is like another example I think is prime of this is like later in John's Gospel with Caiaphas, where he says like, "Is one man to be killed to save like all the people or whatever?" You know, like
Yeah.
where he like clearly makes a prophecy, which is probably something he didn't necessarily say because that's like so obvious. You know, that like it's, or maybe he did or whatever, you know, I don't know, but it's like the way he portrays it as like clearly this guy's like making a prophecy and doesn't realize it or whatever in a very like ironic way.
Yeah, and it's this isn't like I'm not saying anything like new or novel here at all. There's a really long history of scholarship on John's Gospel that highlights the irony in the Gospel. It's actually a really funny text, I think, John's Gospel. I think it's the funniest text in the New Testament and probably the Bible, for what it's worth. Because there's loads of these things where people say stuff that's just like is ironically witnessing to the very truth they're seeking to deny. And so I actually did my undergrad dissertation on the way in which irony is used in its portrayal in John's Gospel portrayal of John the Baptist, and how the same thing happens where you have all these disciples of John the Baptist who are ignoring the fact that John the Baptist is telling them to go and follow Jesus, essentially. And there's all these like layers of irony. In terms of Bethlehem and this passage in John 7, I think what that means is because we can interpret it in one of two ways, we probably shouldn't really factor it into the discussion, because it's not clear what the implication is here. I would want to say that it's not clear evidence of this expectation. It's not clear evidence that there was this widespread belief that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. It might be, but it's just not clear. It might equally be clear evidence that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It's as clear either way. For what it's for how I interpret it. So so the last kind of main bit in the paper is me saying I think maybe we should just kind of park John's Gospel for a little bit, and this speaks into kind of much bigger issues as to whether or not John knew the Synoptic Gospels, which is a whole minefield in scholarship. So I think that John does know Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so I would interpret John 7 ironically, that the crowds are saying, well, he can't be the Messiah because he's from Nazareth, not Bethlehem. Whereas actually the reader is supposed to know, well, actually, no, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, so what are they talking about, basically? But a lot of John scholars would say that actually, no, John doesn't know the Synoptics. So there's all these kind of bigger issues at play. It's like anything in New Testament and biblical studies. If you want to say something, you have to say like 10 things first.
Yeah, that's basically what it seems like, for sure. And John's Gospel is something like that I studied pretty heavily when like a while back, but since coming into like really talking to different scholars and people like yourself, I don't know if John is like such a maybe more of a niche topic that a lot of people don't get into, or it's just such a can of worms that like a lot of people don't talk about. I don't know, because it's definitely like, I mean, even just the idea of how much history is even attempting to tell you is like, I mean, that's up for debate. You know, like at least in like the Synoptic Gospels, it seems like they're at least attempting to tell history. But like John, like that's even in question. You know, like it seems like you really gotta want to study John because it's like its own beast, I guess, is kind of the vibe I've gotten.
Yeah, it's interesting because John scholarship on John's Gospel is one of the biggest like sub-disciplines of New Testament studies, I would say. It's a really big field, which is partly why I didn't do my PhD on it, because it would have meant a lot more reading. But John's Gospel is very rarely brought into discussions about the historical Jesus. And one of the reasons for that is because it's so different from the other three Gospels. So most historians will say, well, these three things say one thing, this one says another, so we'll go with the three rather than the one. But there's been some work recently, and I think there's been at least 3 volumes of a series of texts on John and the historical Jesus that are seeking to kind of redress that a little bit. Because if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all essentially copying off each other, then that's not 3 independent witnesses. That's 1, and then John is another 1. So maybe they're more evenly weighted than we give them credit for. Interestingly, my supervisor Roland Diners, he published a book while he was still a PhD student, which just makes me sick, to be honest with you. But anyway, in John 2, where we have the story of the wedding at Cana, and we have these massive stone jars that Jesus gets everyone to pour the water in and he turns it into wine. That one of the reasons that was considered a non-historical story, other than the miracle, is the fact that these jars are just thought to have been so big that they didn't exist. And he took part in an archaeological dig where they actually found jars that very closely match the description. And he published this book, like I say, as a PhD student, and it's now widely recognised that actually, even if the miracle didn't happen, the historical details surrounding the wedding at Cana story are actually more historically reliable than we thought. So there's been a little bit of a move towards using John more historically than there has been in the past, definitely.
Yeah. And now that we're talking about, we kind of got off topic a little bit. We're talking about John, but I don't know. I have this random question that's been in my head. It might be too random. You might not even know it, but I'm going to shoot it to you anyway because it's about John, and it's something I've always wondered. So in John 11, verse 1, it says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair." And like it has that little thing about how she wiped her hair on his feet, but that doesn't actually take place until chapter 12. So like to me that's always seemed like it was like referencing something else or something. Like it always seemed odd that this like random line was like out of place. You know, like you wouldn't tell a story like before I interview you, I'm going to be like, "Oh, you know Dr. Jonathan Rowlands, who I interviewed." Before I did it. That's a really weird way to tell a story. I don't know if that's like something that like you've ever heard of or looked into, or that means, or that's just something obscure that like you need, like someone would need to look into. It's just like random, and I never think to ask people when I'm talking about John, and for some reason it popped in my head, so I figured I'd ask you.
No, it's a great question. There's actually quite a few things like that in John's Gospel. I don't know if you've ever written like an essay or something, and you do like a first draft, and then you'll go back and you'll add, let's say you split a paragraph into half and you add a paragraph in between the two halves, and then all of a sudden like it's very clearly like disjointed. I do that all the time. I have to rewrite stuff like
that makes sense
10-11 times before it makes any sense. There's stuff like this all over the place in John's Gospel. So it's been years since I've done any like proper study of John, but so I think in John 14 to 17 there are quite a lot of claims that 15 and 16 are later additions, because at the end of John 14 Jesus says something like, "Come, let us stand up and leave," and then he carries on talking for 2 chapters. They stay in the same place, and he carries on talking for 2 chapters, and then at the start of chapter 17, I could be getting my numbers wrong, but at the start of chapter 17, like 3 chapters later, you get, "And with these words they stood up and left." So obviously what's happened is they've added, whoever has like edited the Gospel of John, it's presumably gone through a few different layers of kind of writing and rewriting. Someone has split chapters 14, what we now have is chapter 14 and 17, added these extra 2 chapters of teaching of Jesus, and not like smoothed over the cracks, just left it as this really awkward like 2 chapter gap where the disciples are presumably like stood up waiting for Jesus to go, and they just don't.
Yeah.
And even so, I mean, Rudolf Schnackenberg, who was a Catholic theologian and biblical scholar in the 20th century, he's written one of the most important commentaries on John, like since. It's a massive 3-volume thing. He was very, very conservative, and even he thought that there were some editorial mistakes in the Gospel of John. So if he can admit it, I feel like the rest of us can can admit it.
Yeah, no, that's
but yeah, so Sorry, go on.
No. That's super interesting. Yeah, it's just like I said, it's like these little things that like point out, and a lot of people just aren't willing to admit that like maybe it's just where they split things up, and like you said, they just kind of like the verb tense kind of got out of place, so they left in like whatever, like a little phrase that probably should have been a little later to make sense, but it just kind of got dragged along with the other paragraphs or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at the end of the day, like I just don't think stuff like that matters in terms of Christian faith.
Yeah,
I don't. I think whether they're true is a whole other ball game to whether or not they're well written.
Yeah, I always think about like you die and go to heaven or whatever, and Jesus is like, you didn't believe in me, and I'm like, well, I saw this like random little comma here that like didn't make sense, so I just gave it all up, you know. He's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's justified. Like, no, that's really not the way we like treat things or whatever. And I understand if people have issues, I don't want to like completely downplay it, like, oh, it doesn't matter, there could be errors all over the place, and it makes no sense. But like you said, we got to look at like the truth of these different things and all these different claims. It's not, you don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think is like the one of the big takeaways from what people really need to think about when they are doing this kind of research. Because if you're gonna say that if there's a single error or like something that's a somewhat of a contradiction that you're willing to throw out the New Testament, then you need to just throw it out, because there are issues. Like, you just have to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, this was super cool. I don't know if you have any last points we want to hit on. I think we hit on a lot of your paper. This was really, really interesting. Perfect timing, like I said, with Christmas and everything. So yeah, it's really cool to like hear just a different way of thinking about these things and stuff, and hopefully people that were watching got a little bit out of this. And yeah, so if you want to kind of like last closing statements as we go, and we'll kind of end it here. We're right at an hour, which is what I like to keep my videos at. It seems like people, if it gets much more than an hour, people get a little scared. Like, I don't know if I can listen to people talk about being born in Bethlehem for longer than an hour, but at an hour, it seems pretty good.
Yeah, no, me and you both, don't worry. Yeah, I mean, so I think the main thing I would want people to take away is that, and again, the main thing I have tried to argue in this paper, which will hopefully appear in a published form at some point, either as an article or a book, is that this to say that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem because the Bethlehem birth was made up to strengthen Jesus' messianic claim, is to say something of the gospel writers, and is to say something of Matthew and Luke's culture and society that doesn't seem to be borne out by the evidence we have. It doesn't seem to be borne out by contemporaneous texts. It doesn't seem to be borne out by the Dead Sea Scrolls. It doesn't seem to be borne out by the Psalms of Solomon. It doesn't seem to be borne out by the descriptions of Judah Maccabee, who, again, some debate about whether he's the Messiah. Again, not born in Bethlehem. Not borne out in the description of Simon Bar Kokhba, who, again, not born in Bethlehem. Again, some people thought to be the Messiah. Not borne out in depictions of Herod. Again, he's not born in Bethlehem. We have Josephus talks about an Egyptian who comes to Jerusalem, and it seems that some people think he's the Messiah. He is, by virtue of being an Egyptian, obviously not born in Bethlehem. So again, there's case after case after case of people being claimed to be born in Bethlehem without having been. Sorry, people having
claimed to be the Messiah.
Yeah, having claimed to be the Messiah without having claimed to be born in Bethlehem. And if it's obviously possible for that to happen, then I think we need to rethink the argument that Matthew and Luke made up the Bethlehem birth to strengthen Jesus' messianic claim, because it's clearly not necessary. And if it's not necessary, why are they doing it? And one of the kind of suggestions I make towards the end of the paper is maybe Jesus actually probably was born in Bethlehem. Maybe he was born in Bethlehem. And maybe that's all Matthew and Luke know, and they're trying to fit the rest of the birth narrative around that. But maybe they have this tradition that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and maybe they give that theological significance. Rather, maybe they give the historical fact theological significance, rather than making history in order to give it theological significance. If that makes sense, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, it's like, yeah, I think you said it perfectly. I mean, yeah, people. Yeah, we talked about it a lot, so I don't need to go back to the very start. But yeah, I really enjoyed this for sure, and I hope everybody out there watching did. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, definitely subscribe to the channel. It helps me grow, and like the video. And I have Dr. Rowlands' links. Well, I did have them in the description for his Twitter and his website, but that's on the separate stream that we didn't go to. But that will all get fixed. And yeah, I appreciate everybody who did come by and watch, and I definitely appreciate you taking your time, Dr. Rowlands, to kind of talk about this.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, cool. Well, with that, we're going to sign out, and everybody have a blessed day, and have a Merry Christmas, everybody who's watching, or Happy Holidays, whatever you celebrate.